All right. Just like these theologies that you've just alluded to, which are contextual theologies, eco-theology also falls within that umbrella of contextual theologies. So, eco-theology, it is not a form of an environmental ethic, but it's a form of retrieval of knowledge within the Bible itself and other forms of faith within religion. So that's what we are talking about when we speak about eco-theology. So it's not only limited to Christianity or Christian theology, it extends, to other faiths as well.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Conversations on Puluso Ministries. Today, I have a friend of mine, Sia Kaisa, and I know we're going to have a very interesting conversation about Eco Theology. Sia, welcome to Conversations on Puluso Ministries.
Greetings and thank you so much, Pastor Cliff, for having me here today. Looking forward to the conversation itself.
Thank you. I know we've been talking in the background, you and I, about many things in the theological space and just in academics in general. And I know you are doing eco theology, and it's something that I would want us to maybe dive right into it. Perhaps before we dive in, I know many of our viewers may not know who you are and where you're from and what is this thing you are doing. But so I would like you to just give a bit of background as to who you are and what has gotten you into the type of work that you are currently doing.
All right, thank you so much. Well, my name is Siamtanda Mkaisa. I'm currently based at the University of the Western Cape, where I'm completing my master's thesis within the intersections between systematic theology and eco-theology, but with a greater focus within eco-theology, where I look in particular at the doctrine of the last things, which is eschatology, and try to read it, of course, from an eco-theological lens. So I look at the cluster within eschatology called the New Earth, and try to understand what it actually means from an eco-theological perspective. When we speak about the new earth, are we speaking about it in terms of escaping this particular earth, or are we speaking in terms of the continuity of this particular earth?
That sounds so interesting. So for someone who is not well versed in theology, I know we get a lot of different theology. We get liberation theology, we get feminist theology, we get womanist theology, we got eco theology, which you actually do. So in a nutshell, what is eco theology about?
All right. Just like these theologies that you've just alluded to, which are contextual theologies, eco-theology also falls within that umbrella of contextual theologies. So, eco-theology, it is not a form of an environmental ethic, but it's a form of a retrieval of knowledge within the Bible itself and other forms of faith within religion itself. So that's what we are talking about when we speak about eco-theology. So it's not only limited to Christianity or Christian theology, it extends, to other faiths as well. Yeah, so that's what we basically mean when we speak about eco-theology. But of course, within the context of Christian theology, we will then speak of eco-theology being a retrieval of things such as Old Testament being read through the lenses of eco-theology, and also dogmas or doctrines also being understood within that particular light.
That sounds interesting. I get you now. and I hope it's making sense for our viewers. You mentioned in your introduction that you deal a lot with eschatology, and I know this term may be something that our audience may not be familiar with. What do you mean, in essence, when you talk about eschatology? Could you clarify that for our audience?
All right. When we speak about eschatology, we're speaking about four clusters of Christian hope. Four clusters of Christian hope. So you've got the second coming of Jesus the Christ, which is the first cluster, and you've got then the hope for the resurrection of the dead, which would be your second cluster, and then you've got your third cluster, which is traditionally the judgment, where people or the earth or the human beings would be judged. And then you've got the last cluster, which would be the hope for the new earth, Jerusalem, and all those kind of imageries. That's what, in essence, eschatology is all about. It's divided within these four clusters, but from various traditions it differs. Other traditions would have things such as election and all of those kind of things, and others would have investigative judgments. So from tradition to tradition, how they understand eschatology, it differs. But basically it hinges around these four clusters.
Okay, fantastic. See, that's a very good explanation as you clarify what it means for some of the folks that may not know what it means. There is a phrase. I mean, I've read a bit of eco theology, even though I'm not an expert in it. And there's this term that keeps popping up that states like we are more than just creation, more than creation. What is typically meant by this phrase in your own understanding?
I think that's a very interesting one, because I was speaking about it earlier today with some of my friends, the idea of more than creation, because it could be interpreted in different ways. For example, we can interpret it to speak to the idea of saying that creation, in essence, it's not just creation, but creation, in essence, it's also um, our brothers and sisters within the household of God. You could also interpret it in a very vague and negative way to say we human beings are not just creations or part of this. We are much more bigger than the other created order of the universe. So there's a variety of ways in which one could interpret that particular phrase. But as we have it now, more people are leaning towards the understanding of saying that human beings are better than the other created creatures, which then creates the current ecological crisis that we have today, which is, of course, associated with things such as climate change, air pollution, oceanography and acidification, and so forth, because you view creation not in terms of it being your neighbor within this particular household, but you view it in terms of that which you have the power to dominate.
I see. I think your answer makes segue into my next question, because typically a lot of people understand creation to be human centered, and there's this priority, as I'll put it, that is centered around human beings as the pinnacle of creation. And how problematic is that view, that placing human beings at the whole center of creation and excluding other creatures, not as part of creation, or even the earth itself, as you put it, with all these climate changes that we're seeing around us, how we have actually dominated the earth, so to speak, and how problematic could that be, and how do you make it?
I hear you. I would like to answer you with an illustration. I would like to answer you with an illustration. Let's say today you go to a retail outlet, right, and you go there to buy meat, right?
Mhm.
And for instance, or and in this particular day, as you are buying this meat, unfortunately, there is no meat. There is no beef meat. There is no chicken. The only meat that is there, it is a meat of an infant, a human infant.
Mhm.
Would you buy that meat?
Of course. I mean, I'm
Of,
conditioned not to eat human flesh. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course not. Why?
Yeah.
Simply because in your subconscious, you understand that human life matters.
Mhm.
But when we talk about that particular beef meat that is packaged there, you don't see it as life that matters, isn't
Mm.
it? You view it
Yes.
as life that needs to be consumed to sustain you.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so that's the basic problem that we have as human beings, because you ask yourself, you have people who today are saying a particular race and their life matters. Yes, it does matter, but which other life within the household of God does not matter?
Mhm. Mhm. That's
Does
an
the ant's life matter? Does the flower that you use to urinate, or I mean, the trees that you use to urinate on matter, or does it not matter? For example, I'll try to give a biblical text.
Mhm.
John 3, verse 16, the Bible
Mhm.
says, "For God so loved the world," isn't
Mhm.
it? For God.
Mhm.
But when you read that particular word, world, you realize that it speaks not only about human beings, but each
Yeah.
and everything that exists within the earth or within the world that is created by God. So, what does that mean? It means the ant has a right to claim salvation. The
Mhm.
pig, the unclean pig, it also has got a right to claim salvation, because salvation it is not anthropocentric, but
Mhm.
salvation, it is inclusive of the whole entire cosmos.
Okay.
So the human centric aspect of viewing or understanding the created order really hinges on what I call holy hierarchies that have been created for a very long period of time by um, church leaders in particular.
Okay. So could that be the reason why we find so many theological systems having this human-centeredness approach in them, point out. And I like the fact that you point out that the whole creation, it's more of a cosmos, as you point out, the word cosmos, meaning not only anthropocentric, basically, as you put it. But now what I'm trying to, I know there's a text as well, where I think it's in Romans, if I'm not mistaken, where it says even creation groans to be. So, is that something that in line with what you're saying, that the salvation is not only for human beings but also the cosmos, which includes plants, animals, and so forth? Am I correct to say that?
Correct. I mean, we speak about redemption or salvation from from an anthropocentric understanding. For instance, we would say we are going to be saved from the earth,
Mhm.
isn't it? Redemption is we are being redeemed from the earth, and which means that redemption is not for the earth. If we are going to be redeemed from the earth, it basically means that redemption is not for the earth itself, which then is problematic in and of itself when
Yeah,
you
of
read
course.
that in an ecological lens. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But that means you can do as you please with create the other parts of
exactly.
creation, and and just dominate it and abuse it as much as you want, because anyway you're going to be saved from the earth, as you put it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense. So now,
Mhm.
why then? How do we then make a shift? See, in terms of educating or making people aware that these are theologies that may have come down to us over the ages, may actually be contributing in a negative way to how we actually have this relationship with our fellow creation.
I think everything hinges on the idea of hope. Currently, what we have now, particularly within my tradition, we've got cheap hope, which does not necessarily create a praxis of
Mm-hmm.
actually resolving the ecological crisis and other social crises that we find. Simply, we try and form these escapist theologies to try and avoid, So the trick or the key here, it is within Christian hope, or which of course speaks to eschatology, how we view the how we unpack and understand the very essence of the second coming of Jesus Christ, the very essence of this particular, and of course that's a very difficult thing to do. It takes time for people to be conscientized into understanding that actually this earth as we have it is part of God's plan. It is not, within it's a really funny how, because I was making an example, I'm trying to allude to something. I was making an example earlier on this week in class, and I was asking the students, let's say that your particular office, the office that you are in right now, will burn today, as in the next couple of hours.
Sure.
Would 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 you want to go into that office?
Oh, certainly not. Yeah.
But if I were to tell you that in the next 5 years, your office will burn, what is it that you will do?
Well, it depends. You could start making plans on how to rescue it or how to salvage some of the things that may be in your office. So, yeah.
And that's the problem with us. We don't have these plans in which we can save the earth, simply because we just don't care. That's all I can say. We just don't care as human beings,
I,
and that's
I,
a
I
sad reality.
I think that's a sad reality because we have prioritized humanity, and even humanity in itself is problematic to itself, as you would know that a lot of we have these human hierarchies where probably whiteness would be at the top of the pyramid, white, male, heterosexual, and female, white, beneath that, and black males and so forth. So we have this oppression of human beings amongst ourselves. Hence, liberation theologies came into play, and also what you are doing with eco theology is actually lumping all of that together, not only focusing on one dimension of just human creation, but also the cosmos, as you put it. But now, how do we then um, push back against these theologies that have brought these challenges of us not actually caring about the well-being of the earth?
Um, Currently, there is a beautiful text by Danilo Castillo, if I'm mentioning the name correctly. He speaks about, he tries to create the sense of a liberational view or a liberationist view of eco theology. So it's basically something new to say. Liberation theology of ecological theology or something along those lines, which is beautiful. And I'll tell you why it's beautiful, because it seeks firstly to push away from the idea that eco theology is a white man thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is also that element of saying, no, actually, this particular discipline in theology, it is only for white males and males within Europe, and not really necessarily for people in Africa. And of course, James Cone, in his later works, he also writes about this, simply to say that you cannot really foster, you cannot really speak against the racism if you don't speak against ecological degradation.
Yeah.
And you cannot also speak about ecological degradation if you cannot speak against racism. Now, there are people who benefit from ecological degradation. There
Of
are
course.
people who are beneficiaries,
Hmm.
not victims, but beneficiaries of ecological propagation. And that is to say that we need then to make this particular discipline to be a discipline that touches on all those particular elements. And of course, now to then come back to your question, how is it that we push back against these particular theologies that do not address ecological concern? It's simple. We need what I would call a persistent hope, a theology of hope, as Moltmann would argue, that speaks on persistence of hope in and of itself. Hope that enables or draws us to a particular praxis which speaks, of course, not only on issues associated with ecological problems, but also addresses issues that leads at times to those particular issues, such as exclusion. Another point that is coming to my mind, it is the fact that we Africans have always been ecologically friendly people, if I may put it that way. For instance, within the Xhosa culture, the boys would go to initiation at a certain time. For instance, they would go to the bush during June, and our people knew which herbs would assist these boys. That basically means that there is a relationship with nature that we have always understood, that nature has always been there to assist us in terms of pushing us right with our own selves. Another thing, it would be the question of land, for instance. We people here in Africa, Black people in particular, we understand the value of land because within land, we know that we have our identity. Without land, we have got no identity. So the question of eco-theology, it really touches on everything that has to do with our basic humanity as well.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll see. I'm really taken back by what you are saying. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there's this notion of cheap hope, that people have kind of clung on to, and second to that, you talk about this whole connection with the land that we as African people have always identified with the Mother Earth. But now tell me, in your view, considering that there's cheap hope that people are, gearing towards, and also there's this notion of, there's not enough in the world for everyone, which I think you also touch on Moltmann's theology of hope, which he actually states in his book that there is actually enough for everybody in this world to have to share equally so with the resources that creation is actually giving to us. And you pointed out that there are people who benefit from exploiting the land, basically, and the resources that we find in the land. Could you elaborate a little bit more how you actually draw all these connections?
So how I do this, of course, I do it, of course, from a Christian eco-theological perspective, wherein I draw on the question of eschatology. Now, when I do that, I ask a question which says, for instance, there's a notion or a persistent call of saying Black Lives Matter.
Sure, yeah.
But the question is, if Black lives, now I'm reading it from an eschatological point of view, if Black lives do not matter in the here and now, what gives us an assurance that it will actually matter in the here and now, in the then and there?
Yeah.
So if then also creation is not taken seriously in the here and now, what gives us an assurance that even in the there and there, it will matter?
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
And the question then, it also goes back to God, because it is God who actually created this. And it presents then an ecological theodicy, simply to say, if God is a really just and is a creator of everything in the world, why does he allow the earth to have diseases such as COVID-19?
Mhm.
And of course, that's not a very easy thing to grapple with, because it leads you to more questions than to answers.
Yeah, certainly, yeah, certainly. I mean, if you read the Hebrew Bible, I mean, the first line, it says He created the heavens and the earth. So you have those that dualism that actually happens there. It's not only the earth that He's creating, but He's also creating, which causes now problems for people who are now heavenly focused and not caring for the earth, because it. What about the heaven that He has created? That does it mean that He loves the heaven more than the creation of the earth that He has made? You know, you run into all sorts of trouble when we center humanity as this pinnacle of creation. And
Mm.
tell me, yeah, do you have any instances of scriptural references that show that creation is of value to God Himself? As a lot of probably our audience and would be coming from a Christian tradition, they want to see, does this thing actually come out in the biblical record itself, that God actually cares about creation?
Certainly, there are many instances. There are many instances, but I'll just mention a couple of instances. For instance, let's start with the book of Revelation. Revelation, I think it's chapter 21, where it speaks about the new earth and all of those kind of things. That shows you how God really loves the earth in and of itself. Simply because if you read that text, you realize that there is a balance that is created. That's the first thing. There's a balance that is created between the discontinuity of the earth and the continuity of the earth in and of itself. And when you lean towards the discontinuity aspect of reading that particular text, you realize that the new earth is there simply because this particular earth has been violated by sin, which is, of course, associated with things such as ecological degradation. And that is why there is a need for a new particular earth. But when you read it from a continuity perspective, you then realize that this earth will continue until eternity. That also tells you that God also loves this particular earth. And you then go back to the question of the Sabbath, where God rests. It also tells you that God, to an extent, decides to rest simply because he understands that overworking the earth in and of itself is not good for the earth, and it is also not good for him to be an overworked God.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like that. It resonates with me. I mean, I think it's Broggeman who touches on something like that. That the value of the Sabbath for now. For the modern generation, where he overly emphasizes, for us to take a pause. And to also give the earth a bit of a break, not to exploit it, because we are used to this economic exploitation mindset where we gotta take and take and take and never rest. So we gotta rest, as much as we see that from God Himself, who's doing that. But now I want to ask you: we have this whole symphony that plays out I think it's in Psalms 104. What do you think is the significance of that, where we have this symphony of creation in Psalms 104?
I usually run away from such texts because they tend to overemphasize what other people would call creation theology.
Okay.
And my work is on theology, not necessarily on on creation theology, because those particular texts at times they tend to make those emphasis around the idea of creation theology. And really, theology, in as much as one can say that we are using the terms interchangeably, but it's not as interrelated, if I can put it that way. That particular text presents a question of environmental ethics. which of course is linked also to the notion of ecological theology. But eco-theology in and of itself as a discipline, it is not creation theology, but of course it is also sustained, both of these disciplines, creation theology and eco-theology. At the heart, in my view, it is the environmental ethic. And that's what basically that particular text, in my view, when you read it, it speaks to that.
Okay, it sounds good. You know, as we talk about this, something is creeps into my head that people may say we bringing too much emphasis on creation in terms of eco theology, as you point out, and some may accuse us of pantheism. So could you perhaps maybe explain what pantheism is and the difference between pantheism and panentheism?
That's a very good one, but a very complicated one. What I think, in my understanding, pantheism, it speaks to the distinction of God who is in all creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
While the other element also then, perhaps, if I'm not getting it wrong, it speaks to God as being creation. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if I'm getting it correct. So one says that God is in all creation, and then one would say that God is a particular creation. So God would be a tree, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah.
God would be water, for instance. God would be the sun, for instance. While the other is saying, actually, God is in all creation. But with that one that says God is in all creation, I think it offers a very beautiful um, 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 element in actually speaking around eco-theology, because it enables you to view the earth, not to view creation in terms of how God understands or views creation. Because to say that God is in all, it simply moves us from the idea to say it's only human beings that possess the image of God. But it also presents a provocation that say even the ant itself, there is an image of God within that particular ant. Even the pig that you deem unclean, it also has that particular element of having the image of God, as the Hebrew Bible would present it. But you would know when you go then to Pauline corpus, Paul would speak of a new creation. He would also speak of a new man, and all of those things. And he would also speak about a new Adam. So all of those kind of elements, I think they draw very well. I think it's Paul who also say Christ is all in all. He
Yeah.
plays with the idea of saying Christ is all in all, and that's quite a very beautiful intervention that he makes there. But also it's quite tricky because it could be interpreted to say that God is a tree. But the distinction that I would make, it is to say, yes, God is in all, meaning that each and every created creature in this particular household bears the image of God, or at least has a testimony of God, as Christians would allude to that.
Okay, it makes sense. I mean, see, that we're not, looking at something that we can trample upon, but it's something that it's like our neighbor, if I were to put it there in simplistic
Good.
terms,
Yeah.
to other people who may not necessarily grasp what we're actually talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if I'm looking at a cow or a chicken or whatever, it's my fellow neighbor. It's part of creation. Therefore, I must look after it and so forth. Even the little ants that we may think don't matter, they actually do matter, as far as I hear you allude to how this connection is actually made. But now I'm interested in asking you about the whole, notion of stewardship. We always use stewardship as a symbol that when we talk about Genesis 1 and 2. What are some of the problems that arise when we bring out this whole notion of stewardship in Genesis 1 and 2?
Again, I think the problem for me with the idea or the notion of stewardship, it is that it creates a hierarchy. Why would you now be a steward? When you are a steward, it means that you are above that which you are a steward of. For example, if I'm a steward of a plant, it means that it's part of it, it's under my ownership, it's under my rulership. So my problem with the notion of stewardship, it is that to an extent it's very unethical. It's very unethical because it creates a sense, or it warrants or justifies dominion over the earth by human beings. It warrants and it justifies why we will treat the earth as we please. I prefer the idea of neighbor lines, of saying that actually the tree is my neighbor, and I keep on making this example of how we are so unethical in terms of how we treat the earth. So I was asking this group of students. So they were saying that we have to pray because we were having just a braai session, and they were saying that let us pray, So I asked them, what must we say when we pray? Because a cow just lost its life in order for you to be sustained. So what must we say when we pray? Are we going to acknowledge that there is a creature that died in order for you to be sustained as a human being? And the idea then of stewardship does not really foster that acknowledgement on our behalf. It simply says they are under our rulership, we will do as we please. So for me, I prefer the idea of saying that we are equals within God's household. As Paul puts it, he says there is neither Greek nor Hebrew, to try and dismantle this idea of hierarchies. So I think the most feasible way of viewing creation, it is not through the terminology of stewardship, but it is through the idea of viewing it as our neighbors within God's household, or the oikoumene, as they put it.
Now, see, you point out something quite interesting, because we know, dietary for a lot of human beings on this earth, it's pretty much animal foods oriented, and also there are those who advocate for vegetarianism, which is also plant-based diets, and based on what I'm hearing, the animals have life, but also vegetation also has life, as you put it. So what do we then say? I mean, people may say, it's like the two opposites of the same coin. If I move to plant-based diet, I'm doomed because this is also life, and if I also go to animal plants, animal products, I'm also doomed. How do you reconcile that apparent contradiction?
Yeah, it's a very serious contradiction. It's a very serious contradiction, especially if you've got relationship with nature in and of itself. You've got relationship with the land, and you bring about your own food. So I'm not advocating for vegetarianism or being a vegan and all of those things. What I'm simply saying, it is that let us acknowledge the fact that it's not only human life that matters, but also that tree that you use to urinate. When you can't find the bathroom, that tree also matters. I'm simply saying that pig that you see as unclean or you use for your bacon, it also actually matters. And interestingly, this week, as I was sharing that idea of meat, so a student says, he brings about the idea that pigs are unclean, and I say, according to who?
Mhm.
Who says it's unclean? If it's God, then it's a God problem. It's not a human problem. We have to continue treating our created neighbors in a very dignified way, as we always advocate every month. There is a protest advocating for human dignity, but there is no one who is actually protesting about how undignified we treat our our neighbors in creation. And I don't know if you have ever witnessed a sheep being slaughtered. You
I
would
have many
see
times. Yeah.
how one could you can easily sense the anxiety or the depression, if I can put it in those terms. I don't know what those who are in vet use in order to term these terms, but you could see the stress that this particular ship is undergoing, simply because we simply don't care about this. We only care about our particular needs, which I feel is problematic. And until we learn to acknowledge that a sheep is also losing its life in order for you to be sustained, I
Yeah.
think that's
I mean, I
my
think
main.
it makes sense. I mean, you gotta have that emotion. I mean, if you're seeing a cow or a sheep or whatever, a chicken being slaughtered, you can see it gasping for its life. I mean, we've all probably seen it, but many people probably who live in the cities may just be ignorant, or just tend not to want to even think about it. Just picking up their fresh produce from the shop, which is actually that piece of meat actually was may have been harassed before it
Mm.
and landed up in the shop. So now tell me, Sia, we have this term. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm not an expert certainly in eco theology. This term, refugee, that pops up. What do we mean by that, by refugee?
Well, of course, it does not necessarily really pop up within the current debates around eco theology. It pops up through some of the works within guys who are into eco theology. Because I mean, you would recall, you would know that eco theology comes around the 1970s. It comes through a critique by a Lutheran Christian who then comes and says that Christianity actually bears a guilt in the mass destruction of the earth.
Mhm.
And then the corpus of literature that comes from theologians comes then as a critique to that particular essay or letter by this particular advocate who's a Lutheran by the name of Lynn White. So all the corpus around then eco theology, it needed to prove beyond doubt
Mhm.
that Christianity does not bear guilt, But until later, within the 80s, early 90s, some scholars come into the picture and say, actually, we do bear a guilt. We need to acknowledge that particular guilt. And interestingly, even within my tradition, scholars, they came in and offered some beautiful papers within, it was in 93, 94, 97, because there was a global ecological crisis at that particular time. To simply state, that we have contributed to what is taking place. And that is a very beautiful moment. That is a very beautiful and exciting moment for me, belonging to such a tradition that is able to offer such statements. But where I am going at it is to say that this particular term, refugee or refugium, it is a term that is coming from biology, or the area within biology, which simply seeks to say that all organisms within the earth out to survive. All organism, there is no organism within the earth that should be discarded or dismantled unnecessarily, but all organism should survive. So I'm putting it now within lay terms so that everyone can actually
Okay.
get a grasp of it. So that's the
Very
basic over with the history, of course, of eco theology. Yeah.
That's very helpful. and because I understand what has been said in scholarship as you allude to it. Now, how do we then become these people of refugee, and what does this even look like in practice?
So how do we become people? How do we become those particular people? In my view, it will take years, probably not even this generation. I think we should try to foster within our different traditions, different communities, a sense again of what I would call persistent hope, and really shy away from cheap hope, because I think that's where the problem is, particularly within the Christian space. If we can do away with cheap hope and try to foster a persistent hope, which offers a praxis, to the current ecological problems, then I think we can be these particular people of refugee.
Yeah, I think we are running out of time, and I'm actually enjoying learning about eco theology myself from what you are saying. And I'm certainly of the view that this is actually practical, but it is also challenging, as you put it, that we may not be able to get there in our generation, but at least we are beginning to think about these things and try and make some adjustments as we go about our lives. Now, before I let you go, I know, I mean, you are in the academy, and is there anything in the background that you are doing that you would like us to know about in terms of your future plans, something in the background that you are working on?
All right. Currently, as I said earlier on, I'll be completing my master's very soon, and then I will be also continuing with Eco Theology. But this time around, not really focusing on eschatology, but focusing on salvation. Of course, in my view, currently, there are three ways in which we can understand this idea of salvation. We can understand it through liberation. We can also understand it through reconciliation, and we can also understand it through an eschatological perspective. But I'm focusing on these two ideas of liberation and reconciliation. So within my PhD, then I will be working with salvation, but from, again, an eco-theological perspective.
Sounds good. I think perhaps once you have resumed that work in your doctorate program, then we can get a moment to talk about it when we converse again. I think there will be a something that we can connect on and see how it all links to what we've spoken about today.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. And I hope you're going to come back again. And I know I've enjoyed it, and I certainly feel our audience would love what we have spoken about. Guys, until next time, keep tuning in and stay blessed, and keep writing those questions to us. We try our best to answer you guys, and stay blessed and be hopeful and be those people of Refugee. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.